For those joining us from home, I believe there is a virtual atrium after the service so that you can stay on for a few moments to meet and greet one another. Tomorrow morning service here in the sanctuary at 10, family service in the tent at 11:15, Little Blossoms at 1:30, also in the tent, and then 5 simultaneous study sessions at 1:30. I hope you'll join us. Our afternoon mincha services, including Yizkor, begin at 3:30, Yizkor around 5:15 or so, followed by Ne'ilah.
3:15.
2 Jews sit on a park bench. They've been friends for many years, or maybe they only just met. One looks at the other and says, "Oi." And the other looks back and says, "Oi." And the first one replies, "Oi!" To which the other responds, "Oi." And they repeat this exchange a few more times until finally one friend says to the other, "I thought we agreed we weren't going to talk about Israel anymore." Between friends, between congregants, between the lines of the Jewish press, and certainly between generations, there is division and derision over how to talk about Israel, our beloved Israel. And I like to romanticize that Israel and the dream of reuniting the Jewish people, the people of Israel, with the land of Israel, has been the very thing that united us, and it's only recently that it's the thing that divides us, but it's not so. I've studied Jewish history and I know better. Our dreams of Israel have always been conflicting, sometimes very contentious, but I admit that now the stakes feel higher than ever. The divide runs deep, and the language of discourse is shocking. So let me be clear from the start. Whenever a Jew has survived real danger, whether it be a barrage of rockets or a deadly virus, that Jew comes forward to express gratitude and relief. And she or he does not need to apologize for surviving. The Jewish people must never apologize for being alive. And the Jewish state must never have to defend its right to exist. So, what must one who survives danger do? Bench gomel. That is the ritual of a call and response when an individual comes forward with public expressions of gratitude and a public pledge to devote the rest of one's God-given life for the good. And the congregation responds with affirmation, "Let God give you a chance at all that good that you can bring." In our Torah it is written, "Al tomar bilvavcha b'tzidkati hevi'eni Adonai l'reshet et haaretz hazot." Do not say in your heart, "It is because of my righteousness, it is because of my virtue that the eternal God enabled me to possess this land." Deuteronomy warns against this kind of pride. When defeating an enemy on the battlefield, one might perceive his success as a result of his own power, and the Torah warns against this error in judgment. Power and righteousness must run together. And while both are sources of pride, according to the Torah, pride presents a problem for both, materially and spiritually. And so the Torah takes a different view altogether about power and righteousness. The antidote is humility, in saying, we do not inherit power. We must earn it through righteousness. And once we acquire it, we must continue to earn it through righteousness. Or else, the Torah warns, the land will spit you out. The mitzvah system of Torah does not allow us to release ourselves of the responsibilities of power. Rather, it constructs a different paradigm altogether, and it comes at the very beginning. And not just for Jews, by the way, but for all people. In the first chapters of Genesis, we learn of God's power. God is powerful enough to create and destroy universes. And God is powerful enough to create human beings, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And just as God creates, so must we create. And just as God judges, so must we do our best to judge fairly and with wisdom. And just as God holds back a large measure of God's power in order to create room for the world and for humankind with its free will to emerge, so must we learn to contain and restrain our power in order to make room for others to discover their own powers for the good. I was lucky enough to learn some of these texts with Rabbi Daniel Hartman of the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. I was there for 10 days of study this summer. God is powerful, he says. Be like God. And God self-limits power, and we should too, Rabbi Hartman says. And then he admits, but we are not very good at that. The biblical period produced sacred literature about Jewish power and its limitations. You recall how Moses was not allowed to enter the promised land because he struck the rock, bechozek yad. One of the sins we just admitted to is an abuse of power, bechozek yad. And because Moses struck the rock instead of talking to it, he could not enter the land. And King David, you recall, was not allowed to build the temple in Jerusalem because he had blood on his hands. These are the tragic figures of the Bible. They did everything. They devoted their lives in service to God and the Jewish people, but they had to pay the price of limited power, nevertheless. And then came the period of Rabbinic Judaism, which produced sacred literature about Jewish powerlessness and its limitations. The rabbis ask in Pirkei Avot, Ezehu Gibor, who is truly mighty? And they answer, Hakovesh et Yitzro, the one who knows how to control his own passions. Rabbi Hartman proposes that the challenge of Zionism today is to get back to this rabbinic definition of power. Ezehu Gibor, what is the mark of real power? When one controls one's power, one's own power, and not the power of others. We must pay more attention to guard the borders that define me. Otherwise, the attention that I pay when guarding the borders, which keep others in or out, will be the only thing that defines me. And that is not nearly enough. Our sages teach, use your power on yourself. Cultivate your own righteous power. That is how you know you are really alive. That is how you know you are really strong. And that is how you pay your debts for surviving. See the abuses of power within yourself and limit that power. That is how you make of yourself an emblem of God's goodness in the world. And that is true not only in Israel, that is true right here in Canada. Tomorrow afternoon, one of our study sessions is devoted to national teshuvah, national repentance, in response to the Canadian atrocities that have been validated for all the world to see. And in anticipation of the upcoming first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, we will meet with a panel of Indigenous Canadians, and we will listen and we will learn about this theme of power and powerlessness and the definition of true courage. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg calls the time of Jewish history we are in, the third era. The first was the biblical period, the second, the rabbinic period, and now he says we are in this critical shift. As a post-Holocaust theologian, he pays attention to the shift from powerlessness of the Holocaust to power. This is the fundamental change of the third era of Jewish history. How to use this power is the focus of our laws, the focus of our lore. And Rabbi Greenberg warns that denial or endangering the covenantal use of power is an unforgivable sin. You may have noticed a new book by the brilliant novelist and commentator Dara Horn. It's entitled People Love Dead Jews: Reports from a Haunted Present. Dara Horn notices that both Jews and non-Jews alike prefer to talk about powerless Jews, about dead Jews. The high holidays come and say just the opposite. The high holidays say, I want to talk about living Jews. I want to talk about Jews who are vibrant and vital and alive. And let's consider how a Jew can be powerful enough to effect change in oneself and thereby change in the world, so that the all-powerful God can look upon us with satisfaction in knowing that creating humankind was a good idea after all. This year included painful debates over Israel's power and Israel's disproportionate power. The debate was in the mainstream media. It was like wildfire on social media. The debate, I know, was at our family tables, throughout the congregation, on campus, and in the streets of Toronto. Tal Becker defines a Zionist as someone who gives Israel the benefit of the doubt. That's a pretty low bar, if you ask me. As Ohavei Yisrael, as lovers of Israel, we start with loyalty, and we do not deny Israel's flaws and failings. She has not yet leveraged all of her powers for good. Her hard-won power in areas of technology and trade, in medicine and scholarship, in environmental sustainability and water conservation, in military intelligence and diplomatic relations. The glories of Israel's Declaration of Independence are not yet fulfilled. This year, Israel will turn 74 years old. And we are already planning a congregational trip to celebrate Israel's 75th. Mark your calendars. Rabbi Ed Feinstein reminds us that we love differently in the early stage than in the middle stage. We love differently at 73 than we do at 23. At 23, we are smitten, overcome with the flush of romance and passion. Flaws and faults are overlooked, failures are invisible, for all we see is the beauty and the wonder of the other. By 73, with lined faces and softer bodies, the flaws are well known. The faults and failures are seen, and yet we still love. We see the whole person, the truer self, the noble aspirations and the selfish indulgences, the depth of character, and yes, the power plays too. We know them all, and still we love. At 73, love is deeper, more complex, more forgiving, more mature. We must not hide or cover up Israel's power, nor Israel's powerlessness. We don't like to speak of them in public for fear that the world might overhear and hold them against us. But in Israel, the unintended outcomes of power and powerlessness are painfully visible. The economic gap between rich and poor is shocking and shameful. The power grab of the ultra-Orthodox is unseemly and cannot hold. And while Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel have equal rights on paper, we learned the hard way this year by the protests and the violence in Israel's mixed cities that having second-class opportunities for advancement is unjust and the status quo will not hold. Coexistence may have been the goal for Israel's first 70 years, but now we want more. We want a shared society where every citizen can flourish. Hillel's teaching is as true today as it was 2,000 years ago. Im ein ani li mili, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? The state of Israel must not apologize for taking its place among the nations of the world, and we diaspora Jews ought to be overwhelmingly proud of Israel's hard-won strengths. And on the other hand, Hillel asks, "Uchsha'ani la'atzmi ma'ani?" But if I'm only for myself, then what am I? Israelis and their elected officials and their religious leaders must not define power so narrowly that it shuts out the power of compassion and empathy. And diaspora Jews, we must be expansive in our prayers. We forfeit nothing. We lose no measure of loyalty to Israel by including in our prayers the talented Arab student at Hebrew University, the mournful elder in Ramallah, the innocent child in Gaza. Hillel's first question, if I am not for myself, who will be for me, demands an honest and firm grasp on what is required of us in the here and now, in the earthly Jerusalem. And Hillel's second question, if I am only for myself, what am I then, implores us to imagine what could yet be in Yerushalayim Shel Mala, in that heavenly Jerusalem, if only we will it. It is no dream, if only we will it. The first speaks of realism and pragmatism, and the second speaks of ideals and dreams, and both come from the heart of the Jewish people. Each one alone is only a half-truth. Both are necessary if the Jewish people has a shot at fulfilling our power and potential. If we deny one or the other, if we reject one or the other, if we get so distracted by the noise of it all, that banter, we will lose sight of one or the other, and then we will lose ourselves. Narrow power is easily and inevitably leading to arrogance and callousness, and our Torah has a word for that: idolatry. And on the other hand, an untethered and unjust dream easily and inevitably becomes first foolish and then dangerous too. And our Torah has a word for that as well: idolatry. After a year and a half of global pandemic, we can say tonight that we are all survivors. We are all aware of our power, and yes, our powerlessness too. The fact that we are able to be here to hear Kol Nidre, online and in person, means that we are among the lucky ones. And so we come tonight full of relief and gratitude, and perhaps a dash of guilt as well. We come to publicly testify that we are still among the living. Thank God. Rosh Hashanah comes to teach that we have less power than we realize, and Yom Kippur comes to teach we have more power than we realize. Who shall live and who shall die, that is beyond our control. But how I choose to live and how I wish to be remembered after I die, these are within our grasp. So on this night of Kol Nidre, on this night of truths when we are woefully aware of our power and our powerlessness, we call upon the Eternal One. Let the power of our longings be for you. Help us to grow in the wise use of our powers, that through us your power may be magnified on earth, so we may sanctify this world and labor to redeem it. Ken Yehi Ratzon.